So this session is all about customizing VS Code. Use the stuff in the editor to make a better experience for your developing, whether you're using Puppet language or any of the other languages that we work with. So this is not going to show any specific Puppet code per se, but it's going to show how we can affect our environment to make things better. All of the settings that I'm covering today is in that gist that I have linked there. I'm also going to put it into the Puppet Camp Slack channel, and all the extensions that I'm talking about are also listed in here and also in that gist as well, so that there's no forgetting about it at the end like I usually do. I put it up front. And now we have our demo. So hopefully everyone can see that. That's big enough font for everyone. I tried to make things much bigger than I usually do here, but there's also a point for that in the sense that I'm using VS Code how I need to. I also forgot to put developer mode or screencast mode on so you can see the keys that I type. So as you can see, I have a couple of settings already enabled, and just to keep or just for demo purposes. I disabled the minimap. Some people like it, some people don't. I'm one of those that don't like it, but to each their own. The other thing that is to each their own is font ligatures. Now I'm doing this first just to show what the difference is in a editor, to show how these settings can affect your readability. The whole point of enabling things or disabling things like this is to make it so that it's easier for you to read the code. Some people don't like ligatures. I kind of do, because it makes the Puppet code look a little nicer. So these are built-in support for that VS Code has that's not enabled by default, that you can explore and figure out to see if that helps your workflow. Using that kind of topic of things that you can enable to help figure out things. If you're in a Puppet manifest like I am on the right-hand side here, and you hit Control Space in order to initiate the IntelliSense or the autocomplete, you'll just see a list of things here, and you may not remember on how to enable the documentation for each of these particular types here. VS Code can help you with that by enabling Show Status Bar. So if that's enabled and we go back to our manifest, we have a bar at the bottom here. It's kind of hard to see a little bit, but on your editor, it'll be much larger. And it tells you insert is enter. So if I hit enter here, it would insert that particular snippet. And if I want to see more detail, I hit Control Space, and then I get the information right here. So you don't always have to remember every single keyboard combination there is. Sometimes we can make the editor work for us and provide us the information, and that makes it a little bit more efficient for us. Going toward the efficient, some things in VS Code allow you to change their behavior. So I can, instead of having the default value of inserting whatever tab complete or autocomplete we're doing, I could have it replace the value. This helps you utilize your editor how you see fit. I use insert myself, but I could see replacing working well for other use cases. Another thing for visual, you see a thing in the left-hand side here. We have our indents for the file tree. I'm getting older. I have bad eyes to begin with, so that's kind of hard for me to see. So if I make this bigger for the indent, I get a more defined indent, something bigger for me. I can make the editor look how I want so that I can visually see, especially for Puppet control repos where you have multiple folders, multiple files. To bring that one step further is indent guides. If we save this, it's going to add lines here for your indent. So another thing for visual, having things that are easily visually popping in your editor will enable you to quickly look at things faster and not have to sit here and Control plus and make the thing bigger just so that you can go and look at the size editor. Okay, so that's all in fit and finish and making things look better for your environment. Let's start on some productivity stuff. VS Code has a default behavior. It opens up a welcome page when you first start VS Code. That is fine for the first few times you use it, but maybe you don't want to see it after a while. You can set the behavior for a new or for an open window to several different settings. I use new untitled file, so that means that when I just open up an editor, I'll get a new blank file. You can also make this do README, which is an interesting option. This will open up the README automatically for any project that you open first, and then it'll fall back to the welcome page if there isn't a README there. Nice little things to help you go to the first thing that you want to know about. Interesting little tips. Building on this new file thing, having a blank file without any syntax is not always very helpful. First thing, so you can set the default language for that new file to be Markdown, and that will help you have Markdown enabled right away. So taking notes, for example, is the first thing you do when you open up the editor. Sort of does that. And if you save a Markdown file, it's not even all that hard to change it. And Markdown gives you some syntax completing stuff. So it's good prototyping kind of file choice. But let's say that you don't want Markdown, you want a specific language. Well, you can change that to whatever you want here. But then picking different languages for the default language may become cumbersome, maybe something that you don't want to have to do all the time. So there's a special variable here called the active editor language. And what this will do is it'll open up, depending on what file you have open, what file you have open determines what language is enabled. So right now I have JSON enabled. If I do a new file now, it'll open up a file with the JSON syntax and extension enabled. So I'll get JSON immediately. If I instead do over here for a Puppet file and I open up a new one, it has the Puppet syntax here. So I get Puppet completions and information. So really useful tip that accelerates your workflow. Next thing is for badges. So I have several tabs open over here, and I have a file save indication, and that it's modified. But maybe I want a little bit more over here. I have one error here because of white space. I want an indication of that easily for me to see. So if we enable decorations on that, you'll see it pops up a 1 up here. So it's telling me I have one error as well as the file being modified. So if you have dozens of tabs open or different window configurations, it's a really good visual, easy way of seeing what's going on with the file. And if we get rid of the error, that immediately goes away and save the file, and then the modification goes. Nice visual things that help you be more efficient with your coding. Okay, so at the top over here, I have this little call out that I was supposed to say first, and I even put it there so I remember, but I didn't. So let's talk about it now. I like to use the JSON editor here to edit my settings when I'm trying to get specific settings for my workspaces. You can use the visual editor if you want to do the same things that I'm doing here, and sometimes it's easier to find certain settings by typing and having it filter them for you. But in terms of maintaining your settings file, it's nice, or it's useful to organize between settings that you're going to do for all languages and settings that you could do for specific languages. And the reason is that most of us nowadays are working in multiple languages. Different projects have different conventions, new lines, carriage returns, all of that other fun stuff. VS Code can help you do that by just having it all out like this, or for enabling language-specific files here. In this case, I'm doing Git specific settings here, and this will, so that anytime I open a Git commit editor, so if you use VS Code for adding your messages to your Git commits, this will apply then. These rules I don't want 72 character width for Puppet files or other things like that. So it's only going to apply for the git commit things. And this is a nice feature here of VS Code in the sense that I can set the word wrap to 72, and as I type, it will automatically insert a new line without me having to remember to hit enter when I hit 72 characters. So nice little improvements here to help your workflow. By keeping it inside the git commit section, I have that sectioned off, and Puppet files and other languages won't be messed with. Okay. So I keep forgetting to save my file as I go on, and so I have to save and then redo my demo here a little bit. One of my favorite features of VS Code is the file autosaving. Now I run with after delay, and then I set a several milliseconds to save the file. But having it autosave on any one of these events here will help you chain things to happen inside VS Code. We can use this setting to have the Puppet extension automatically format your files, either as you type or as you save. But before we get to that, one tip here in terms of using extensions in VS Code. Extensions are activated based on events. So if you open up a Puppet module, it'll see that there's the Puppet module files in there, and it'll know to load the Puppet extension. If you opened up a JavaScript project, it's going to start to load the JavaScript extension, Node, etc., all those different types of file types. So VS Code does a really good job at figuring out what it should be loading at what time for which file. There are some times, though, where there's two extensions that could possibly do something for a file, and VS Code just use who activated first, who was in the first list, or some non-deterministic way of figuring it out. In our case, in Puppet's case, we have Puppet file, which is a Ruby language syntax. The Ruby extension activates most times before we do. And so it'll grab the Puppet file and says, that's something I handle. We don't want that because of a new feature that we have in the VS Code released a couple of months ago that does Puppet file resolution. So it'll go through here and resolve my Puppet file, or the modules that I have in my Puppet file, and tell me if I have a incompatibility, or if I'm out of date, or if there's a problem over here. As you can see, I can hover and get the information. It also shows up in my problems pane down here. But I won't get this if Ruby gets to the file first. So I can tell VS Code to specifically always for Puppet files use the Puppet extension. And you can use this for any other language. So you could have things for here for HTML, for PowerShell, for whatever the particular thing. For me, the only thing I deal with every day is Puppet files. So that's the only one I have in this particular setting. Okay. So this is all helping the editor at large. This is all helping us make the editing experience better, but Puppet specific settings and tips. I'm going to make a Puppet specific block, like I was saying before, for Git, and also duplicate sometimes my settings in here. Why? Because I work on many different projects, many different languages, and also some have different conventions. So I can put settings in here inside Puppet that conflict with maybe editing C# or Golang projects or PowerShell. And it'll make sure that the Puppet stuff stays with its stuff, or stays with its conventions. I also can put stuff in my user settings here. See how we have the user settings file open, and I can put stuff in here, and it will work for me for my projects. But if somebody has a VS Code settings file inside of their project and they commit this in here, and they have different settings in their workspace settings thing, that will override mine. And so that will make a ability for someone who's running a project to say, this is what I want your editor to behave like for this project, for these file types, for this tab size, spaces, etc., like that. And it's just a way of agreeing upon settings beforehand. So I can have my personal stuff and you can have project specific. different ways of handling where the settings go can allow you to have different configurations and switch between projects without having to remember that you need to change something per project. All right, so on to that formatting thing that I was telling you about with the settings. There's two settings here to do, or two operations here to do to enable formatting on typing for Puppet. And that's because of the way that VS Code works. VS Code works that you have to opt in to formatting on save or any of the modes here. And that's because sometimes that could be a costly operation, both time or memory or things like that, depending on how the language extension is implemented. So as a user, I have to say true. I want it formatted on save, and I want it to go format on type. But VS Code goes one step further, and we've all had a file where we go to make a change and our setting to format the file goes and formats the file, and now it's a 200-line diff instead of 1 line. Well, VS Code has the option here to only save on modifications. Now, we could do it on the file where it does the whole file at once, but if we keep it at modifications, that will only modify the line that we are editing, so that we can continue to edit a file without having to change the formatting for the entire file. This is really useful when you're contributing to other people's projects, other people's modules, etc., where you don't necessarily have control of how this formatting should be set. So the second part of enabling the formatting is now in the extension side. So these are Puppet specific settings, whereas these were VS Code specific settings. Now, the reason why these are outside of our Puppet block here is that, like, for instance, if I move my setting here, VS Code will tell me that these aren't language features, these are extension features. So this one doesn't support a per language configuration. So we move it out and we keep it close to our Puppet block, and then we'll know that these things go together. So again, VS Code conventions, we have to opt in to formatting. So tell Puppet format to be enabled, and then format on type to be enabled. Now, when we first added this feature, we had a 4K limit file size on it. That's configurable now too, so you can use another setting to increase that limit if you want. But now this will format on type. So I'm not going to tempt it, but you can format on typing and have your hash rockets align as you go write your manifest. And it will only modify the lines that you're editing. Okay. The resolve Puppet files. Wow, VS Code just blinked. Yes, I will not talk about demo gods anymore. So resolve Puppet files is by default true, but I set it as true in my file just because I want to ensure that that setting is there for all the projects I work with. It is okay to duplicate settings or have defaults set to the default value, just so that you are insulated from any changes that an extension does. For extension I used to use a lot of time changed all of its defaults from one version to the next, and because I was using the default values on this, I never even noticed that they went and changed things, but the other users did. So sometimes it's good to have your default set here. Okay, so that helps with normal running of the extension. There are some things that you may not enable all the time here. There are some settings where you would want to only enable for some projects or only enable for some periods of time. So I'll cover that right now. Module path. The extension does a great job at finding all of the types and providers and modules that you have inside your workspace. Excuse me. But it doesn't do a great job of knowing outside the current workspace, because it can't know where you have the rest of your module set. So you can set your module path here. And as you can see, it's platform dependent in terms of what your delimiter is. This can be either set in your user settings, or it could be set in your workspace settings, or it could be set on a machine-wide settings. So it's a nice, useful configuration point there. Different projects will have different setups in different places. Different machines have kind of different locations. So you can play around with what level that gets added. Sometimes you may be working on a specific Puppet version. So you can set the extension to only use that version. Now that's useful if you don't want to use or prevent using a new feature or something in a different version of the language. So you can either set it by writing the version specifically there, or if you go to a Puppet file, you'll see our toolbar helper here. You can click that, and then you'll get a list of all the versions that are available with your current source. So in this PDK, I have all of these different Puppet versions available, and I can pick that, and it'll change that value instead. It just don't want to restart just yet. Now let's say something goes wrong. Not everything works 100% all the time. So if you want to find out what's going on in the extension, you can enable these two settings. You're not going to run these all the time because it outputs a lot of information. But if you want to open up a issue with the Puppet VS Code extension, enable these things, go take the log, copy paste it into a GitHub issue, and then we'll get working on it. So it's nice to have these just commented out in your settings so that you can uncomment them when something's going on. Okay, that was all Puppet specific stuff. One of the last things I wanted to cover, and Ben is going to have to keep me honest here about going overtime because I can keep talking all day, is Bolt. The Puppet extension provides by default built-in task validation. So let's say you have a Bolt task here. You can have autocomplete and validation for each of these things for inside of a Bolt task. But it doesn't help so much for the Bolt project files. You're not going to get anything for YAML per se, other than the minimal autocomplete. Well, we can work with other extensions to help us out. So we can use many things from our community. One of the big things about Puppet is the fact that we use both community work and our own work, and we make ourselves more powerful when we work together. So I'm going to enable the YAML extension from Red Hat here and point it over to the schemas for each of these Bolt project files. And once I do that, then I get immediately a IntelliSense list for what I can do with a Bolt project file. I don't need to remember all of these things. I don't have to go out to the docs to go look at what the doc information for each of these settings. And then if I actually hit one modules, it auto completes and tells me immediately this is an array of things that I have to add. So just simple little helpers that can make it much more productive and efficient. This is a separate extension, and it's all documented on how to use it over on the Bolt site. Okay, so speaking about extensions, there's the list of extensions that I have in the PowerPoint. These are other extensions that I find useful. You don't have to use them, and depending on what languages you're using, you may or may not use them at all. But I like the Better Align extension. It helps above and beyond what the Puppet extension does. Formatting files correctly is a very hard problem, and this does it very well for lots of different constructs. So as you can see in the screenshot, it's got bunches of different rules for different constructs, and it's just a addition to what we provide in the extension. The Git Lens extension, we could do a whole session on just this and how much it helps. I know a lot of people don't like graphical user interface stuff, but this really has a lot of features that it's worth your while to take looking through it. The rebase interface that they just released, really useful thing that you can use from the keyboard. So definitely take a look at this. If you're a Bolt user, you're most likely going to be working in cross-platform languages. If you're doing any kind of Windows automation content, you're going to want to have the PowerShell extension there. Provides a lot of helper stuff for that. Of course, the Puppet extension, I'm a little biased, but we're going to want that. What I would really love to today to go into is the remote development, but I don't have time today. I did a session last year for the Puppetize about using the remote containers and the remote WSL session extensions here. But as you can see, I'm on a Windows box here. I work with Linux and Windows all the time, so these two are essential for me. I have a WSL instance with my Linux stuff set up so I can go and run my Linux code without having to leave Windows. I can bounce back and forth and not have too much problem in thinking of it. Obviously the Ruby language, and then there's the Red Hat YAML extension here. With this, I can have syntax help for all sorts of YAML. So if you've used Relay, they have a schema that can be used by the YAML extension. So you can get some of the same autocomplete and IntelliSense in your editor there. One quickly thing, and then Ben, you can yell at me for time. I wanted to mention the remote extension thing here. For settings and optimizing VS Code, you can have a dev container in your project here. And I wanted to call it out because it's something that we have a PDK specific dev container for. But we can use VS Code to add it for us. So we can add a development container configuration file. And they're only going to show the Microsoft ones, so we're going to just show all definitions. And then these are all pre-canned Docker container files, but we have one for the development kit here. So if we click on that, it automatically adds another configuration file for us. We can copy paste the settings that we have in our settings and put them inside of this so that when we start containers, we have the same settings for those containers. It can also inherit the settings that we have synced. So we don't have to have anymore our machines set up with everything that we ever needed. We can have a container set up with everything so somebody can one-click go and not have to remember that their Linux bash should be configured such with these specific settings. I wasn't paying attention to channel. Is there any questions?
Sean has a real interesting one. He was excited at the idea of having a custom YAML schema to validate your YAML files. And he was wondering if you knew of any project, either existing or in the works, that could read your Puppet code and like identify what parameters and what data types, et cetera, are expected for classes and turn that into a schema that would validate your HIRA configuration if you did auto parameter lookups.
No, I don't, but that's a very interesting thing. If you want to put that as a discussion item in the community repo I linked or the PDK repo, we can definitely explore what that would mean. The YAML extension that I showed, wrong thing. The YAML extension I showed, you can create your own here. So this is pointed to a HTML link here, but you can point to a file location here for it too, and just tell it what kind of files that it's supposed to match for. So these can be local. So if you create your own schema, you can use the Red Hat YAML extension to run that validation. But I don't know of anything that we have to generate something from the HIRA configurations, but that is a very interesting idea.
David has a question, and I kind of feel very specifically called out by this question here. He wants to know if you have any real good tutorials or courses or anything recommended to get started with VS Code, because he and many people try to get into it and then just sort of like fall back to the thing that we're all comfortable with and just go back to using Vim.
Yeah, I feel called out too for that. It's one of my continual to-do items is to make that a more of a formalized getting started kind of steps kind of thing. The Puppetize session that I did last year was a non-traditional format in the sense that it went for a how do you work with someone else using VS Code on Puppet code kind of thing. So it showed on how to use VS Code in these scenarios of like contributing code back and forth, or doing pair programming, or just working on code spaces or Gitpod kind of thing. So that is my first thought for that. The VS Code community is very large. There's lots of languages that use it as its primary interface editor. They have what they call VS Code days. Every release party kind of thing. And so there's a bunch of videos on there that are getting started, or having to how to use the extension for different scenarios. So those are some of the places I would go. The VS Code project has a lot of walkthroughs, or the VS Code website, the main one, has a lot of walkthroughs too. The documentation site for our Puppet extension, which is linked inside the extension. I'm afraid to open it with the demo gods in front of recorded share screens, but that has also some videos of certain features working. So like IntelliSense autocomplete documentation, or doc support. Those have little videos that show those working, so those are good starters. But I think Ben and I both will take it as another action item out of this to prioritize the getting started with VS Code and Puppet kind of series.
Absolutely. Michael has a point and a question. He wanted to remind people that there are Vim binding extensions, so that you can kind of at least be familiar and comfortable with the keyboard shortcuts and all of that in VS Code.
Yes,
Um,
that actually is a very good point. It reminded me of something that I didn't mention. This is a very VS Code focused session, but the backing language server for this is Ruby, and it's using the language server protocol. So that means that the front end here, what your editor you use, can, as long as that uses the protocol, it can use our work in the back end. So there is a community blog post that uses the latest NeoVim client with that to use our language server in the back end to use the same stuff that you see in VS Code in terms of the IntelliSense and auto-completion and documentation and all those other features inside Vim. And I've been remiss at getting it merged, but another person in our community showed how to use the language server with Vim Spectre to get a debugging experience going. So we're not just VS Code, even though this is a VS Code demo.
the language server is real exciting for me. I have a side project of bringing it to another editor that I'm more familiar with, which I'm super excited about. Michael has one more question, and I think then we'll probably go ahead and call it. But he wants to know if you have a good tutorial on using dev containers with VS Code.
Yes. So there is that puppetized session that I mentioned. I did show using a dev container in a scenario of creating one for someone who just got a new computer and doesn't have their tools set up. So I walk through creating that for a module and showing how that could work out. If you want something more in depth that's not necessarily Puppet focused, but the same concepts apply, though the VS Code days, the most recent one, they announced the remote container / code spaces thing, and they have 4 or so sessions that were devoted to just how do you start a dev container, how do you configure a dev container, what does it look like. I really wish I had the time today to go through that, but those are definitely useful too.
Right on. Okay. The settings.json that James referenced and was talking about earlier, he has gisted, and it is posted in the Slack. If you scroll up just a little bit, it's attached to Chad's question about the settings.json. You'll find that link there. And then we'll also follow up in chat with a couple of links to some of the different things we talked about, and if there are any interesting language servers that we can reference as well.